Working as a cleaning lady on a cruise, the woman fell to her knees when she realized that the millionaire was her husband who had died 5 years ago. Emma Jones once lived in a small, sunlit apartment tucked away in a bustling neighborhood, its old walls full of love, laughter, and promise. She and David had found it after months of searching, wanting something that felt theirs, a home that could shelter dreams, even if it came with peeling paint and worn-out floors. Emma still remembered the day they first stepped inside. David, with his infectious smile, had laughed, twirling her around the room, promising that no matter where they were, he would always make it feel like home. Life with David had been far from luxurious, yet every day felt like a gift. David was a man of quiet strength, steady and devoted. They didn't need much. Their love filled the gaps that money could not. Their furniture was a haphazard collection of hand-me-downs, but they spent hours making each piece their own, polishing, painting, and creating a sanctuary from the outside world. Emma had a knack for homemaking, turning the simplest items into pieces with charm. Evenings were their favorite time, spent side by side cooking dinner or sharing stories on their cozy sofa. They both worked modest jobs, Emma as a part-time librarian and David as a mechanic. Their salaries were small, but they managed to save for weekend getaways to the countryside, where they'd walk for hours, hand in hand, dreaming aloud about their future. David was always full of ideas. He wanted a little house in the woods one day, perhaps even with a small vegetable garden. Emma loved how he saw beauty in simple things. It matched her own outlook. For Emma, every glance, every touch, and every shared meal strengthened their connection. Their life was simple, but she never felt she was missing out on anything. David had an endearing optimism, a belief that as long as they were together, they would always be okay. It was this unwavering faith that made Emma feel as though they were building something lasting, something sacred. Years went by, and though life threw its usual curveballs, they faced each one together. They didn't have a lot, but they had enough. Their dreams were shaped by the reality of what they could afford, but never did they let go of their hopes for a better, brighter future. Emma and David's bond was woven from the fabric of shared dreams and whispered promises. They both longed for a family, talking often about the children they hoped to have someday. David would imagine them as little explorers, running around the small garden he envisioned, a place of warmth and safety where love would blossom as naturally as the wildflowers they dreamed of planting. Their discussions of family were always full of quiet joy. Emma would light up at the thought of a child with David's kindness and her curiosity. She imagined their future child's laughter filling their home, tiny footsteps scurrying across the worn floors, the sounds of a life they built together. She sometimes joked that, with their limited income, they'd have to be resourceful in raising a child, but David would always reassure her. "Love is enough," he'd say, pulling her close. "We'll make it work, Em. We always do." David's devotion showed in the way he planned ahead, saving little by little from his earnings to secure a future that might be less financially strained. Even if they couldn't afford much, he dreamed big, hoping to give Emma and their future children a sense of stability and peace. There were nights they'd stay up late, mapping out their dreams, from a better apartment in a quieter neighborhood to the idea of taking a real family vacation someday, perhaps to see the ocean. One day he surprised her with a tiny box. Inside, there was a delicate pendant engraved with the letters E&D entwined in a heart. "For our dreams," he said softly, clasping it around her neck. Emma wore it every day after that, a little symbol of the life they were building together. Though money was always tight, they never let it overshadow the warmth they shared. Each challenge was met with patience, each obstacle overcome with a renewed sense of commitment. They understood each other deeply. Even in moments of frustration, they rarely argued, preferring to find a way forward together. David's reassuring words and gentle touch were Emma's anchor in a sometimes chaotic world. They made promises to each other, promises to weather whatever came their way. When David spoke of his hopes for their future, his eyes would light up, reflecting a quiet intensity that Emma found irresistible. His dreams were hers and hers were his. Each supported the other in ways big and small. One night, they lay on a blanket in a nearby park, gazing up at the stars, fingers intertwined. David spoke softly, almost as if he were speaking a secret to the sky itself. "One day, we'll have that little home, that family. We'll be happy, I promise." Emma's heart filled with an overwhelming sense of love and gratitude, feeling as if they were woven into each other's souls. In those moments, she felt like they were truly unstoppable. Despite the trials they faced and the modest means they lived by, their hearts were rich. The future, with its uncertainties, felt like a journey they were more than ready to face together, for they had each other. And to Emma, that meant they had everything. When David died, Emma's world collapsed, each carefully built dream shattering around her. In a single moment, everything they had planned for, every promise they had made, seemed to vanish. A car accident, the police had told her. A crash on a stormy night while he was on his way back from work. But the strangest, most haunting detail of all was that his body was never found, only the wreckage of his car submerged in the nearby river. For months, Emma lived in denial. She held on to a fragile hope, imagining that David would walk through the door any day. Her nights were spent half waking, listening for footsteps that never came. But as time passed, the weight of his absence settled heavily on her shoulders, dragging her down to the bleak reality that he was gone. Left alone, Emma faced the unrelenting pressure of bills and debts she never knew they had. David had managed the finances, always assuring her they were fine. She soon learned otherwise, discovering overdue notices hidden in drawers, mounting bills, and unpaid loans that seemed to double overnight. Each letter was a reminder of a life she could barely keep afloat on her own. Worse yet, Emma now had another life depending on her. Her young daughter, Lily, who was too young to understand why her father was no longer there. Every day became a new battle. Emma struggled to find work that would pay enough to cover their rent and buy groceries, but she could never seem to catch up. Without a college degree, her job options were limited to low-paying, long-hour positions. She picked up odd jobs, cleaning houses, working as a cashier, and even doing overnight shifts at a bakery. Sleep became a rare luxury. Exhaustion weighed down every movement, but she pushed through because she had no choice. Lily, unaware of the financial strain, would ask about her father from time to time, each question like a knife to Emma's heart. "Mommy, when's Daddy coming back?" Or, "Can we go to the park like Daddy promised?" Each innocent question was a painful reminder of everything they had lost. Emma found herself at a loss for words, giving her daughter gentle smiles and hollow reassurances. She did her best to fill both roles, mother and father, but it was a weight she felt every moment. Their modest apartment, once filled with David's warmth, now felt cold and empty. She sold many of their belongings to make ends meet, each sale another goodbye to the life she had once known. The treasured pendant David had given her remained, though a small, tangible memory of the promises they had shared. She clung to it in her darkest hours, feeling the delicate engraving against her palm whenever despair threatened to overwhelm her. Through all of this, Emma was determined to give Lily a good life, even if it meant sacrificing every bit of her own comfort. Her love for her daughter became her sole purpose, her only anchor in an increasingly difficult world. She lived paycheck to paycheck, struggling to keep them afloat. There were times she was tempted to give up, but every time she looked into her daughter's innocent eyes, her resolve would harden. For Lily, she would bear any hardship, take on any job, and push through every day, no matter how bleak. Life may have taken David from her, but Emma was steadfast in her mission to protect her daughter's future. Though the future felt daunting, she knew she would do whatever it took to survive. For Lily's sake, Emma would never give up. It was a late evening when the police came to Emma's door. She remembered every detail vividly, as if the scene had burned itself into her mind. The night was dark, with a light drizzle falling, and she had just put Lily to bed. The knock was firm but hesitant, as though the bearer of news knew the weight of what they carried. Standing at her doorstep were two officers, their faces serious and filled with a solemn empathy that only served to tighten the knot forming in Emma's stomach. The words, accident and river, reached her ears, each syllable a punch to her heart. They explained how David's car had skidded off the road in the rain, crashing through a guardrail and plunging into the river below. Rescue efforts had been hindered by the storm, they said, their voices steady, but tinged with sadness. Emma was numb, her world reduced to a silent void. She struggled to comprehend the news, barely registering the apologies or the reassurance that they had done everything they could. The officers explained that the current had been especially strong that night, likely sweeping David's car downstream. There was no sign of his body, only the wreckage of his car caught in a tangle of branches along the riverbank. Their voices felt distant, as if she were hearing them from underwater. "Are you certain?" she asked, her voice breaking, clinging to the hope that this was some kind of horrible mistake. But the officers only nodded, their faces shadowed with the weight of their duty. They handed her a damp, scratched watch they'd recovered from the wreckage. David's watch, a gift she had given him for his birthday, engraved with their initials. The sight of it brought her to her knees, and she sobbed, clutching it to her chest, as if holding it tight enough might somehow bring him back. Days turned into weeks, and Emma felt as though she were caught in a waking nightmare. Her life became an endless cycle of waiting and hoping for news, yet dreading what any further news might bring. David's body was never recovered, and the lack of closure gnawed at her, leaving her with an aching emptiness and unanswered questions. There were no answers to the why that tormented her each night, only a harsh reality she was forced to accept. In the face of her grief, Emma still had to stay strong for Lily, who was too young to understand what had happened. Every day, she fought to hold herself together, trying to keep up a semblance of normalcy for her daughter's sake. She learned to plaster on a brave smile, hiding her heartbreak beneath a mask of motherly reassurance. Yet, deep down, a haunting doubt festered. The unanswered questions weighed heavily on her. Why had David been on that particular road? Why had he left work so late? And how was it that, after all this time, his body had simply vanished? As the months went on, whispers of doubt crept into her mind, trailing her like shadows. In those quiet moments when she was alone, Emma found herself wondering if there was more to the story. But each time the doubts arose, she forced herself to push them away. She had no choice but to accept the reality handed to her. David was gone, and whatever mysteries surrounded that night would remain buried with him. And so, she pressed forward, determined to make sense of a life that had become a hollow echo of what it once was. The weeks following David's death were a blur of grief and confusion, but as the dust settled, Emma was hit by another wave of devastation. Financial ruin. She had known their income was tight, but David had always reassured her that they were managing. He'd handled the bills, always waving off her offers to help with a warm smile and a quick, "Don't worry, Em. I've got it covered." But now, the truth emerged in harsh, unrelenting waves. A week after the accident, Emma received her first call from a debt collector. She was holding Lily, trying to distract her with a story when her phone rang, jarring her from the bittersweet moment of calm. The voice on the other end was cold and detached, asking her to pay a debt she knew nothing about. Stunned, she fumbled through the conversation, unsure of what to say. It didn't stop there. Day after day, more bills and notices arrived in the mail, a mountain of debt she had never imagined existed. Credit cards maxed out, loans unpaid, late fees compounding relentlessly. She found herself staring at envelopes with amounts she could barely comprehend, each one another piece of evidence of the life David had kept hidden. The debt collectors were ruthless, calling day and night, each demand more aggressive than the last. She tried to explain her situation, tried to plead for more time, but they were unyielding. The realization hit her slowly and painfully. David had been drowning in debt, and now, in his absence, the weight had shifted entirely onto her shoulders. The house, their belongings, even her meager savings, everything was on the line. She tried to reach out to friends and family, but everyone had their own burdens, and most could only offer sympathy, not financial assistance. Late one night, after putting Lily to bed, Emma gathered every scrap of paperwork she could find. She spread them out across the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she tried to make sense of the numbers before her. It was overwhelming. The amount they owed was staggering, more than she could ever hope to pay back on her own. She realized then that David must have been hiding his struggles, perhaps hoping he could fix things before she found out. But now, That secrecy had left her on the brink of financial collapse. The debt collectors didn't care about her situation. They threatened legal action, warned her that if she couldn't pay, they'd seize everything she owned. Emma could barely sleep, haunted by visions of being thrown out of her home, left with nothing for herself or for Lily. She began selling anything of value: jewelry, electronics, furniture. Each sale felt like another goodbye, not just to David but to the life they'd built together. Still, the debt barely shrank, and the collectors grew more ruthless. They were unrelenting, and her once cozy apartment soon felt like a prison, every ring of the phone another reminder of the financial storm that loomed over her life. Exhausted, Emma found herself at a crossroads. She could either continue as she was, drowning under the weight of debt and heartbreak, or she could make a drastic change. She had never imagined herself in this position, alone and barely holding on, but she knew she had to find a way out. For Lily's sake, she would have to find the strength to endure and find a path forward, no matter how daunting it seemed. It was in that darkest moment that she resolved to do whatever was necessary to survive, vowing to protect her daughter from the hardships she herself now faced. With every passing day, Emma's resolve grew stronger. She had no choice but to confront the reality before her. Her dreams of a peaceful life had vanished with David's death, but her duty to her daughter remained. Lily was her hope, her motivation, and her reason to keep pushing forward. With the apartment nearly empty and her resources drained, Emma began searching for any job that could offer enough pay to keep them afloat. She soon realized that her small, scattered jobs wouldn't suffice. She needed something steady, something that could provide enough income to tackle the mountain of debt threatening to overwhelm them. Through a friend of a friend, she heard about opportunities on luxury cruise ships. The hours were long, the work was grueling, but the pay was significantly better than what she could find locally. The idea terrified her. She'd never spent so much time away from Lily, and the thought of leaving her daughter even temporarily made her heart ache. But with a grim sense of determination, she told herself it was the only way forward. If she could work hard and save every penny, perhaps, just perhaps, they might escape the cycle of debt that had ensnared her. Emma made arrangements for her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Caldwell, to care for Lily while she was away. Mrs. Caldwell had always adored Lily and agreed to help, reassuring Emma that she would look after Lily like her own granddaughter. Still, the night before she left was one of the hardest she'd ever faced. She spent hours watching Lily sleep, committing every detail of her daughter's face to memory: the soft rise and fall of her breathing, the way her little fingers clutched her blanket. When morning came, she kissed Lily goodbye, whispering promises she hoped she could keep, that she would be back soon, that everything she was doing was for their future. Lily clung to her, confused and teary-eyed, her small voice asking why her mommy had to go. Emma swallowed the pain in her chest and forced a smile, telling Lily that it would only be a short time, even though she wasn't sure herself how long she'd have to be away. The journey to the cruise ship felt surreal, a whirlwind of preparation and nerves. She had been hired as part of the cleaning staff, a job that would involve endless scrubbing, tidying, and organizing. The luxury of the ship was overwhelming at first, the grand halls and elaborate suites a sharp contrast to her own life's recent hardships. She barely had time to take it all in before the work began. The physical strain was immense. She spent countless hours on her feet, moving from room to room, cleaning spaces that the ship's wealthy guests would barely notice. Her hands became raw from scrubbing, her body ached from bending and reaching, and her mind was often fogged with exhaustion. Yet through it all, she thought of Lily, reminding herself that every task she completed brought her one step closer to a better life for them both. Despite the emotional toll and physical hardships, Emma remained resolute. She spoke little to her co-workers, preferring to keep her focus on her work, each shift blending into the next as she put her all into earning every cent she could. She knew she couldn't afford distractions, couldn't risk losing this opportunity, no matter how exhausting it became. Each night, she lay in her tiny cabin, clutching the pendant David had given her, its small heart-shaped surface a bittersweet reminder of the life she'd left behind. Her world had changed completely, but as long as she had breath in her body, Emma vowed that she would fight for her daughter's future. She was determined to endure, pushing herself beyond her limits, holding on to the hope that someday, all of this sacrifice would be worth it. Emma's new life aboard the cruise ship was far removed from anything she had ever known. The ship itself was a floating palace, a sprawling vessel adorned with opulence that seemed reserved for the elite. Gilded halls, crystal chandeliers, plush carpets, and intricate tapestries covered every corner, each space echoing with a refined extravagance that bordered on excess. It was hard to believe such a world could even exist, especially while she was drowning in debt. Emma's job was to clean the rooms in the first class and VIP suites, places she'd never imagined even setting foot in. These suites were the size of small apartments, with private balconies overlooking the endless ocean, marble bathrooms with gold fixtures, and sprawling living areas. Everything about the spaces felt surreal, and Emma often found herself awestruck as she dusted statues, polished grand mirrors, and tidied up the private lounges where passengers entertained themselves and their wealthy friends. The work was physically taxing. Each morning began before dawn, her shift starting while the wealthy passengers were still sleeping. Armed with an array of cleaning supplies, she moved quickly and methodically, working to have each room spotless before the guests awoke. Sometimes she barely had time to eat or take a break, and often, her hands throbbed with pain from the constant scrubbing and polishing. Yet, she took comfort in knowing that every completed shift meant a little more money to send back to Lily. Emma's supervisor, a stern woman named Ingrid, was particular about every detail, inspecting Emma's work with a keen eye and pointing out even the smallest flaws. Emma took each critique with quiet resolve, knowing that there was too much at stake for her to falter or make mistakes. Though it was difficult, she pushed herself each day to meet Ingrid's exacting standards, determined to hold on to this job. But the emotional toll was perhaps the hardest part to bear. Being away from Lily was like a constant ache, a deep longing she could feel in her bones. Emma called home whenever she could, grateful for Mrs. Caldwell's updates, but the sound of her daughter's small, hesitant voice over the phone always left her with a pang of guilt. Each conversation reminded her of what she was missing: Lily's first words, her favorite bedtime stories, the small moments of childhood slipping by while Emma was miles away on the open sea. Working on the cruise ship also brought Emma face to face with a world she couldn't ignore, a stark contrast to her own struggles. She saw families laughing together, wealthy couples relaxing on private decks, children running down the halls with the kind of carefree energy that only privilege can afford. Each encounter reminded her of everything she had lost and everything she still had to fight for. And yet, despite the hardship, Emma kept her focus. She counted down the days to her next paycheck, setting aside every dollar she could spare for Lily's future. The job wasn't glamorous, and each day drained her, but she took pride in her ability to endure. She worked quietly, invisible to the guests but known among the crew as the woman who never complained, never wavered, and never let her pain or exhaustion show. As the ship sailed from one exotic location to another, Emma reminded herself why she was here. She had a purpose, and that purpose was stronger than any weariness, stronger than any despair. For Lily's sake, she would endure, and with each completed shift, she believed she was one step closer to giving her daughter the life she deserved. Life on the cruise was isolating, and Emma often felt like she existed in a different reality from everyone around her. She moved among the other crew members, most of whom seemed equally worn by the demands of the job. Many of them had stories similar to hers, tales of sacrifices made for loved ones, of dreams deferred to support families back home. But despite this common thread, Emma found it hard to connect. She was grateful for the job, but every day felt like an emotional tightrope. The wealthy passengers were a world unto themselves, seeming to float through life with an ease that was painful to witness. They lounged in silk robes, laughing over extravagant meals, sipping from crystal glasses, oblivious to the people who served them. Emma became used to being invisible, seen as merely part of the backdrop that kept their luxurious lives comfortable. She moved through their spaces silently, discreetly, avoiding their gazes, all too aware that they barely noticed her presence. The few times she did have brief interactions with passengers were often uncomfortable reminders of her place. One morning, a woman had asked her to fetch an extra set of towels, her tone clipped and dismissive, as if Emma were a piece of the furniture she could command at will. Another time, a man had barely looked up from his tablet as he directed her to tidy up a bit faster, as if her presence were an inconvenience. Each encounter solidified her feeling of invisibility, of being overlooked in a world that wasn't hers. As the ship traveled to destinations she'd once dreamed of seeing, Emma found herself with no time or energy to explore. While the passengers roamed historic ports and scenic beaches, Emma remained on board, busy with the endless tasks of cleaning and restocking. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was surrounded by the beauty of the world, yet she could only catch glimpses through the porthole windows or while hurrying from one cabin to the next. She could almost laugh at the absurdity of it, if it didn't make her heart ache. Her only escape came late at night, once her shift was over and the ship had quieted down. On those rare evenings when exhaustion didn't claim her first, she would slip out to the ship's deck, letting the cool night air wash over her. She would look out at the endless expanse of dark ocean, sometimes catching sight of distant stars or the faint lights of coastal towns. In those moments, she allowed herself a breath, a small slice of freedom in an otherwise confining routine. Her cabin was small and barely furnished. A narrow bed, a dresser, a small porthole that offered a view of the endless sea. Each night she would lie in bed, her aching body pressed against the thin mattress, and stare out at that small round window, wondering how long she could endure this isolation. Loneliness wrapped around her like a shroud, and at times she felt as if she were adrift, lost in a life far removed from her own. The memories of David and their lost dreams often surfaced during these solitary nights, haunting her with thoughts of what might have been. The life she had once imagined was so distant, the love she'd thought would carry her forever now only a fading echo. But each time she felt herself slipping into despair, she thought of Lily's face, her daughter's innocent smile, and the dream she still held tightly, to give her child a future free of fear and hardship. That single thought renewed her strength, anchoring her to the hope that, somehow, all of this would be worth it. Despite the challenges and loneliness, Emma's determination never wavered. Each morning she woke up before dawn, her body weary but her spirit resolute. She pushed herself to work harder, moving through her tasks with a quiet tenacity that surprised even her. It was as if all her grief, her anger, and her longing had transformed into a relentless drive to survive, to endure not just for herself but for Lily. Emma kept a small photo of Lily tucked into her pocket, a faded picture from her daughter's last birthday. On her breaks, she'd pull it out, studying her daughter's bright eyes and dimpled smile, as if by some magic the photo could bridge the distance between them. It was a comfort on days when the work seemed endless, when the ache in her back and the sting of her sore hands threatened to undo her. The sight of Lily's face reminded her that every sacrifice she made now was a step toward a better life for her daughter. Over time, her colleagues noticed her relentless work ethic, her quiet refusal to complain or slow down. She earned their respect, even if she didn't share much of her story with them. Some of her co-workers, like Maria, a mother from Brazil who was also working to support her family, would occasionally join her for quiet conversations over meals, sharing stories about their children, their hopes, and their struggles. These rare connections offered Emma moments of solace, gentle reminders that she wasn't entirely alone in her hardship. One evening Ingrid, her supervisor, pulled her aside. Ingrid had watched Emma work tirelessly over the past weeks, noticing her dedication and the meticulous way she cleaned each room, never cutting corners. "You're a hard worker, Emma," she said, her normally stern face softened. "It's rare to see someone put in as much effort as you do, especially under these conditions." Emma offered a tired smile, grateful for the acknowledgement but unsure of how to respond. She couldn't tell Ingrid that each scrub of the floor, each polished surface, each neatly made bed was done with a single purpose in mind, to escape a life of endless struggle and to build something better for her child. Instead, she simply nodded and thanked her. Ingrid's words had an unexpected effect on her though. For the first time since boarding the ship, Emma felt seen, even valued. The realization gave her a renewed sense of purpose. She began to imagine that if she could keep up this pace, Maybe she could eventually save enough to bring her closer to a life of stability. The exhaustion was still there, the ache in her bones unrelenting, but her resolve grew stronger. She began setting small goals for herself, tracking her progress and counting down the weeks, each paycheck bringing her closer to freedom. Her nights became less restless. She would lie in bed, visualizing the future, imagining the day she would reunite with Lily, free from debt and worry. The image of holding her daughter close, of watching her grow up without the constant shadow of financial ruin, kept her going. Emma clung to these dreams as the ship continued its journey. Each port they visited, each shift she completed, each penny she saved became a small triumph. She learned to focus on the things she could control, to channel her pain and frustration into something productive, transforming her hardship into strength. Though the path was grueling, Emma knew she had no choice but to keep going. Her life had changed in unimaginable ways, but with every challenge she overcame, she felt a little closer to regaining control of her future. No matter how difficult the journey, she was determined to see it through, driven by a fierce, unbreakable love for the little girl waiting for her back home. One evening after a long shift, Emma was cleaning a high-end restaurant on the upper deck, a space reserved for only the wealthiest passengers. She moved quietly through the tables, her focus on finishing her tasks, so she could finally rest. The room was empty, the dinner service over, and she was alone with the quiet clinking of glassware and the soft sound of distant music playing somewhere on the deck. As she worked, she noticed a couple enter, laughing and chatting as they took seats near the large window overlooking the ocean. They seemed oblivious to her presence as she quietly cleaned around the far tables. Her attention drifted for only a moment, but something about the man caught her eye. Something achingly familiar. She couldn't place it at first, thinking perhaps it was just exhaustion making her see things. She tried to look away, but her eyes returned to him, her heart picking up speed. His profile, the way he held himself, the slight tilt of his head, it was all too familiar. She felt a chill creep up her spine, a coldness that froze her in place. No, it couldn't be. Her mind raced, grasping for an explanation, but the resemblance was uncanny. She took a shaky breath, feeling an intense need to look closer. As he turned slightly to speak to the woman across from him, his face was fully illuminated by the soft lights of the restaurant, and in that instant Emma's breath left her. It was David. Her heart hammered in her chest as she fought to process what she was seeing. She'd clung to the hope, faint as it was, that somehow he might still be alive, but to see him here, laughing and alive, after all these years, after all her grief, it was incomprehensible. He looked different, somehow more polished, his posture relaxed, exuding a confidence she'd never seen before. He was dressed in a tailored suit, his watch glinting in the low light, a sharp contrast to the modest man she remembered. Sitting across from him was an elegant woman, smiling warmly as she listened to him, her laughter filling the quiet room. Emma's heart twisted, the sight of him with another woman igniting a storm of emotions she hadn't felt in years. Her hands clenched around the towel she was holding, her mind reeling with disbelief and anger. She thought of the years of pain she'd endured, the debt, the exhaustion, the loneliness she'd borne, all for the sake of her daughter. And here he was, alive, well, and apparently wealthy. Emma stumbled back, her vision blurring as a flood of memories and emotions surged through her. She felt her knees grow weak, a torrent of hurt, betrayal, and confusion overwhelming her. How could he be here after everything he'd put her through? How could he have left her to suffer, to struggle alone while he lived in comfort, surrounded by wealth? She fought to steady her breath, to contain the mix of grief and anger that was boiling within her. Her entire world, her entire understanding of the past 5 years, was being ripped apart by the sight of him. Every hardship, every tear she'd shed, every moment she'd spent struggling to survive had all been for the memory of a man who had seemingly moved on without a second thought. The room spun around her as she grappled with the urge to approach him, to demand an explanation, but she hesitated, rooted to the spot, unable to tear her gaze away from the stranger who had once been her husband. Emma stood frozen, struggling to breathe, her heart thudding like a drum as she watched David. The disbelief was like a physical weight pressing down on her. her body barely able to hold itself upright. The man she had loved, the man she had mourned, struggled for, sacrificed so much for, was right here in front of her, laughing, alive and utterly unchanged. Yet he was also completely changed, a polished version of himself that she barely recognized. She couldn't make sense of what she was seeing. His clothes, tailored and fine, were nothing like the modest outfits he'd worn when they were together. And the woman beside him, she was glamorous, dressed in a sleek black dress that hugged her figure, her jewelry sparkling in the dim light as she leaned into him with familiarity. The ease between them, the way David's hand casually rested on hers as he spoke, shattered any remaining hope Emma had that this was just a look-alike or a misunderstanding. A wave of anger surged through her, hot and unrelenting. How could he sit here so casually, surrounded by luxury, while she had been drowning under the weight of their debts, working herself to the bone to provide for their child? How could he look so at ease, so content, while she had spent years scraping by, haunted by his memory? The shock gave way to fury, her mind reeling with questions and accusations. How long had he been living like this? Had he always planned to abandon her? Was everything they'd shared, every promise, nothing but a lie? Her hands began to tremble, her nails digging into her palms as she fought to contain the flood of emotions that threatened to overtake her. Her thoughts flashed back to the day the police had come to her door, the officer's grim expression as he'd explained the accident, the empty condolences they'd offered when they told her David's body hadn't been found. All those nights she'd cried herself to sleep, clutching his watch as if it were a lifeline. All the years she'd told herself to keep going for his sake, for the sake of the life they'd dreamed of together. And here he was, living a life that looked more like a dream than anything they'd ever imagined. Emma's vision blurred with tears as she watched him, feeling the weight of every sacrifice, every struggle, every painful decision she'd had to make without him. She wanted to scream, to confront him, to make him explain how he could betray her so deeply. But as she watched him laugh, completely unaware of her presence, she felt the depths of her hurt rise like a tidal wave. A small, frightened part of her whispered that she could be wrong, that there might be some innocent explanation. But her heart, which had once believed so fiercely in his love, couldn't deny what was in front of her. This was David, and he was alive. Every lie, every sacrifice, every moment of grief she'd endured was because of him, and he had let her suffer, let her believe he was dead while he lived in comfort. As the room spun around her, Emma took a shaky step forward, still uncertain if she had the strength to confront him. She was furious, heartbroken, and yet still reeling with disbelief. How could the man she had loved, the father of her child, have faked his own death and abandoned them? With a deep, steadying breath, she resolved that she couldn't leave this room without confronting him, without demanding answers. Her voice trembled as she took another step toward him, driven by a mixture of pain and anger that left no room for fear. David had to face the truth of what he had left behind. Emma's legs felt heavy as she took each step toward the table where David sat, her heart pounding with an intense mixture of anger, betrayal, and sorrow. She rehearsed words in her mind, but they tangled and twisted, turning into raw, tangled emotions she could barely contain. All she knew was that she needed answers, and she wouldn't leave without them. As she approached, David looked up, his face shifting from the laughter he'd shared with the woman beside him to a sudden, puzzled recognition. His eyes widened, his smile fading as he processed her presence. For a split second, he looked just as shocked as she was. But then, just as quickly, his expression changed. His face smoothed into an unreadable mask, his posture growing rigid. "David," Emma said, her voice steady despite the tremor running through her. The sound of his name felt foreign on her lips, yet it carried a weight that demanded his attention. The woman beside him looked between them in confusion, glancing at David as if expecting him to clarify who this strange woman was. David's eyes darted around, as if searching for an escape, but he was trapped. Slowly he recovered, giving a slight shake of his head as if to deny what was obvious. "I think you're mistaken," he said, his voice tight, forced. "I don't know you." The words hit her like a slap. She couldn't believe what she was hearing, couldn't fathom that he would go so far as to pretend he didn't even recognize her. She felt her anger harden, her resolve sharpening in the face of his denial. This was her husband, the man she had mourned, the man she had believed dead. And he was denying her, denying their life together, denying everything they had once shared. Emma took a deep breath, fighting the urge to shout, to lash out. Instead, she leaned closer, her voice low but firm. "David, don't do this. Don't stand here and tell me you don't know who I am," she said, the pain in her voice unmistakable. "I buried you, grieved for you, spent 5 years wondering how I'd survive without you. And here you are, alive, pretending you don't know me." David's face hardened, his eyes flickering with something she couldn't quite read. Fear, guilt, maybe even anger. But he kept his voice low, measured. "I'm sorry," he murmured, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. "You must have the wrong person. I think you're confusing me with someone else." Emma's fists clenched at her sides, her whole body trembling with a storm of emotions she could barely contain. "Don't you dare," she hissed, her voice still barely above a whisper, but carrying all the anger and betrayal of years spent in the dark. "How could you do this to me? To our daughter? I've been raising her alone, drowning in debt, while you've been here, pretending we never existed." David's expression shifted then, a shadow of something darker flashing across his face. He glanced again at the woman beside him, who was looking increasingly alarmed and uncertain. He sighed, the mask of composure beginning to crack. "Emma, he stammered, unable to meet her gaze. Emma's heart pounded as she took in his hesitation, sensing the walls of his deception starting to crumble. She had come too far, endured too much, to let him dismiss her with flimsy excuses. Glaring into his eyes, she whispered, "Tell me the truth, David. I deserve that much after everything you've done." His shoulders sagged, and he looked away, clearly realizing he could no longer hide behind his pretense. For the first time, she saw the guilt in his eyes, a confirmation of everything she had feared. As the truth loomed, Emma steeled herself for what was coming, bracing herself for a revelation that would change her life forever. David hesitated, the mask slipping as his gaze faltered. The woman beside him was looking between them, her confusion deepening into worry, but David's focus was on Emma, a look of frustration crossing his face. Slowly, he pushed back his chair and stood, guiding Emma a few steps away from the table to a quieter corner of the room. Once they were out of earshot, his expression hardened. "Emma, I don't know what you think you're doing," he muttered, his voice low and edged with annoyance. "This is not the time or the place." "Not the time," Emma echoed, her voice trembling with a mixture of hurt and anger. "You let me believe you were dead, left me to face everything alone, and now you're worried about timing. After 5 years. Her eyes filled with tears she fought to hold back, unwilling to let him see her break. "How could you do this, David? How could you leave me and Lily? We mourned you. We barely survived without you, and you just disappeared." He crossed his arms, his face a mask of irritation, his tone harsh and devoid of the warmth she remembered. "Emma, I had no choice. You don't understand." "Then explain it to me," she demanded, her voice hoarse. "Explain how you went from being my husband, Lily's father, to this," she said, gesturing at his expensive suit, his polished appearance, the life he'd crafted without them. David sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose as if the conversation were merely a nuisance. "It wasn't that simple," he said quietly, still avoiding her gaze. "I had debts, Emma. Debts you didn't know about, debts that were going to ruin us. I didn't want you and Lily dragged down with me." Emma's hands clenched at her sides, her frustration growing with every word. "And your solution was to let us believe you were dead, to abandon us, to disappear without a word." Her voice was rising, and she struggled to keep her composure as her heart shattered all over again. "I spent years working myself to exhaustion to pay off those debts. I've given up everything for our daughter's future. And you're telling me you just left us to save yourself." David's face hardened further, the remorse in his eyes dimming as he met her gaze with a look of cold resolve. "It was for the best, Emma. I saw an opportunity and I took it. I had to start fresh, away from all of that. away from the life that was suffocating me. I didn't ask you to do anything for me or Lily. The callousness of his words struck her like a physical blow. She felt her chest tighten, struggling to breathe as she looked into the eyes of the man she had loved, a man she no longer recognized. You didn't ask because you left me with no choice, she whispered, her voice thick with pain. You abandoned us and made your life easier, while I sacrificed everything. How can you stand there and be so indifferent? David's gaze flickered, but he remained silent. His jaw set in a way that suggested he felt no regret, no guilt, only a resolute determination to keep moving forward without her. Emma's heart broke anew, her world crumbling once again, but this time the pain was sharper, tinged with a bitter clarity. The man she had loved, the man she had once trusted with everything, was gone. She realized with devastating finality that she and Lily had been nothing more than a burden to him, a chapter he'd closed with no intention of looking back. With her voice trembling, she finally whispered, "You're not the man I loved. I don't know who you are anymore." As she stared at him, her sorrow turned to resolve, a fierce determination burning within her. If he had chosen to abandon them, to cast them aside, then she would ensure he faced the consequences of that choice. David's expression darkened as Emma's words settled between them, but she didn't care. She stood her ground, unwilling to back down, waiting for an explanation that could justify the pain he had caused. Finally he exhaled, his gaze shifting, a hint of irritation in his voice. "You think it was easy for me to leave. You think I wanted this. I did what I had to do to survive. To survive." Emma's voice quivered, her tone laced with disbelief. "You weren't the one struggling to survive, David. It was. Lily was. I was working 2, sometimes 3 jobs, sacrificing everything just to keep us fed, just to keep a roof over our heads. You weren't surviving, you were hiding. You left us to fend for ourselves so you could run off and live in luxury." David's eyes flashed with something like anger, though he quickly stifled it, forcing a calm he didn't feel. "It wasn't about luxury," he said quietly. "It was about freedom. I couldn't keep pretending, Emma. The debts, the responsibilities, the life I felt trapped in. I saw a chance to start over and I took it. Do you know what it was like to feel suffocated by everything we'd built, everything we were supposed to be?" Emma shook her head, her mind reeling as she processed his words. "You felt suffocated. I thought we were building a life together, that we had dreams and plans. But all along you saw us, me, Lily, our future, as some kind of cage." Her voice grew louder, her anger surging as the full weight of his betrayal settled over her. David's gaze dropped, his face momentarily softening with a flicker of something that could have been remorse. "I didn't mean it that way," he murmured. "But I couldn't breathe, Emma. I couldn't see a way out. The debts had piled up, and I didn't want you or Lily dragged down with me. Faking my death, it seemed like the cleanest way to end it. I could start fresh, rebuild without any of the baggage." Emma felt a chill spread through her. She had imagined so many scenarios, wondering what she could have done differently, blaming herself for things beyond her control. But never had she imagined that David had simply seen their life as baggage, something to be discarded so he could live free. The depth of his selfishness struck her like a blow, robbing her of words. "And the debt," she finally managed, her voice barely a whisper. "You left me to handle all of it, David. Every single bill, every collector's call. Do you know what that did to me? What it cost us?" David shrugged, a hint of indifference creeping into his tone. "I assumed you'd find a way. You always were strong, Emma. I knew you'd make it through." Emma's hands clenched, her anger twisting into a raw, visceral pain. He had left her, left Lily, without a second thought, assuming she would simply shoulder the burden of his choices. In his mind, she realized, she had been nothing more than a stepping stone, a person he could rely on to bear the weight of his mistakes while he escaped to a new life. She looked at him with fresh eyes, seeing the man she had loved now stripped of every illusion. David had faked his own death, leaving her and their child behind, knowing full well the hardships she would endure. He hadn't even cared to check if they were all right, hadn't looked back even once. "Well, David," she said, her voice shaking with a fierce determination, "you're right about one thing. I am strong. Strong enough to make sure you pay for what you did. You may have left us behind, but I'm not going to let you walk away from this." David's expression faltered, a flicker of doubt crossing his face as he realized the strength in her words. For the first time, he seemed genuinely afraid, a shadow of fear clouding his otherwise indifferent gaze. Emma held her ground, knowing that she had just reclaimed the power he had stolen from her so many years ago. Emma's hands shook as she took a steadying breath, her heart breaking all over again as she faced the reality of David's betrayal. The man standing before her wasn't the husband she had cherished, nor the father Lily had lost. He was a stranger, a man who had discarded them both without remorse. She felt a pain so deep it was almost physical, a wrenching ache that threatened to pull her under. But underneath that pain, something else was growing, a fierce, unyielding resolve. 4 years, she had been at the mercy of David's decisions, first in the debt and struggle he had left behind, and now in the painful truth of his abandonment. But she was done with being a victim of his choices. She would not let him continue to live freely, oblivious to the destruction he had left in his wake. She was stronger than that. She had become stronger because of what he'd put her through. And now, she knew she couldn't leave without seeing him held accountable for his actions. Taking a shaky but determined step forward, Emma met his gaze, her voice low and steady. "You might have thought you could escape the past, David, but I'm not letting you walk away from this. You left us, abandoned your family, and let me bear all of your burdens alone. You don't get to pretend it never happened." David shifted uncomfortably, his indifference now tinged with visible unease. He seemed to be sizing her up, trying to determine if she was bluffing. But as he looked into her eyes, he must have realized the fire in them, the unwavering strength that told him she was serious. "What do you expect to accomplish, Emma?" he said, his voice filled with impatience. "You can't change anything. What's done is done." Emma held her ground, feeling an unexpected surge of power as she stood tall before him. "Maybe I can't change the past, but I can make sure you don't get away with it. You think you can just walk away without consequences. I know who you are, David. I know everything you've done. And I'll make sure everyone else does too." David's face paled slightly, his composure finally slipping as he realized the depth of her determination. 4 years, he had convinced himself that he was safe, that his past would never come back to haunt him. But he hadn't counted on Emma finding him, hadn't imagined that she would uncover the truth and confront him like this. The realization seemed to unnerve him, his cool arrogance now replaced with a faint flicker of fear. "Emma," he began, his voice strained, but she cut him off, her tone sharper than ever. "No," she said, her words firm and unyielding. "You don't get to say anything else. You had 5 years to reach out, to care, to check if we were okay. And you chose not to. You chose yourself. So whatever you have to say, I don't want to hear it." Her voice softened, but it held a strength that made David's silence deepen. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect Lily and myself from you. I'm done being a shadow in your life, a woman you can leave behind without a second thought. You abandoned us, but I'm taking my power back. I'll make sure that you can't escape what you've done." With one last look, she turned and walked away, her heart heavy but her spirit unbreakable. She had finally freed herself from the hold David had over her, reclaiming her life with a fierce resolve. Now she would find a way to ensure he faced justice, not only for herself but for the future she was determined to build for her and Lily, free from his betrayal and free at last from his lies. Back in her small cabin, Emma's mind raced with the weight of her decision. She felt exhausted, her body and heart worn from the intensity of the confrontation, but her purpose was clear. David might have chosen to erase his past, to start over with a clean slate, but she would make sure he was held accountable for abandoning his family and leaving her to face his mountain of debts. This was not just about revenge. It was about taking back her own life, her own dignity, and finally freeing herself from his lies. She took out a small, worn notebook she had brought with her, one where she jotted down thoughts for Lily, stories she wanted to share with her daughter one day. Now she turned to a blank page, her pen moving purposefully as she began to list everything she knew about David. Details of the debts he'd left behind, the false accident, and the way he had evaded responsibility by letting her bear the financial and emotional burdens. Her thoughts were clear and sharp as she outlined everything she'd endured, all the proof she needed to make a case against him. Emma knew she couldn't do this alone. She needed guidance, legal help, someone who could take her evidence and build a case that would hold up in front of authorities. She thought of her few connections back home, friends who had been there for her after David's death, people she could trust to help her find a lawyer who would take her case seriously. This would be no small fight. She was up against a man who had buried his own identity and rebranded himself in a world of wealth and privilege. But Emma was prepared to face the challenge head-on. There was a strength in her now that hadn't existed before, an unwavering determination born of the years she had spent in survival mode, enduring what David had left behind. Her fingers shook as she flipped through the pages of her notebook, a quiet reminder of everything she'd sacrificed, every hardship she'd borne. Her sacrifices hadn't been in vain, and she was done letting him go on without consequences. With her heart steadying, Emma began drafting a letter. She wrote out everything she could think of, details of the debts, the day the police had told her about his accident, the financial ruin she had been left in, and the suffering he had caused not only to her but to their daughter. She didn't leave out a single painful memory, knowing that each word, each fact, could help build the case against him. As she wrote, she felt the anger and hurt transform into something powerful, something that gave her a renewed sense of purpose. She had been a victim of David's selfishness, but she would no longer allow him to have control over her life. She was reclaiming her story, taking every piece of her past that he had tarnished and using it to forge a new path forward. She finished her letter, sealed it, and placed it in a folder alongside her collected evidence. Her hands were still for a moment, a sense of calm settling over her as she took in the importance of her decision. She would go to the authorities and she would seek out his creditors, each step one of reclaiming her agency, her strength, and her future. It wouldn't be easy, but she was ready for the journey. With David's lies laid bare, Emma felt a freedom she hadn't experienced in years, a feeling that grew as she realized she was taking back control, piece by piece. She knew it would be a long road, but for her and for Lily, she would walk it without hesitation. The next morning, Emma set out with a determined heart. She'd spent the night awake, her mind buzzing with plans and strategies. She could barely believe how far she had come, from the woman left shattered by grief and debt to the one now determined to stand up against the man who had wronged her. Now it was time to take action. Emma's first step was to contact the ship's onboard legal advisor, a quiet woman named Clara who handled passenger disputes and staff issues. She had seen Clara in passing and knew she was approachable. During their brief meeting, Emma carefully explained her situation without giving away too many personal details, simply mentioning that she was in a challenging legal position and needed some guidance. Clara listened attentively. Her eyes filled with empathy as she nodded. "I may not be able to take on a case like this myself, but I can help you make some connections," Clara said, handing Emma the business card of a reputable lawyer who specialized in fraud and debt cases back on shore. "This lawyer, Mr. Callahan, has experience dealing with high-profile cases. He's thorough and compassionate, and he'll make sure you get the justice you're looking for." Emma accepted the card with gratitude, relief flooding her as she realized she now had a concrete lead. The next time they docked, she would make the call. She knew this was only the first step, but it felt monumental, a small victory on her journey to reclaim her life. But Emma wasn't stopping there. Her next move was to get in touch with David's creditors. Over the years, the relentless phone calls from debt collectors had been a constant source of stress, and she knew some of them would still be tracking David's unpaid debts, especially now that he was living openly as someone else. With their resources and experience, these creditors might be able to help expose his fraudulent actions. She carefully composed an email, writing to several major creditors who had reached out to her after David's death. Her words were precise and factual, detailing David's abandonment and his ongoing life under a false identity. She included every detail she knew about his new identity, his lifestyle, and his presumed wealth. She sent the email with a quiet sense of triumph, knowing she was finally standing up to the ghosts of debt that had haunted her for so long. Over the next few days, Emma waited for replies, each step a test of her patience and resolve. She stayed focused on her job, her body still moving through the motions of work even as her heart burned with anticipation and determination. When she finally received responses from a few creditors, her heart leapt. They were shocked, interested, and, most importantly, willing to pursue legal action if she could confirm David's whereabouts and provide supporting evidence. Encouraged, she set a time to meet with Mr. Callahan, the lawyer Clara had recommended. She knew that once she provided him with the details of David's scheme, he could help her push forward with a case against him, bringing her closer to the justice she so desperately sought. Callahan's reputation was solid, and he assured her over the phone that he had dealt with similar cases of abandonment and fraud. Emma was reassured, feeling for the first time that she wasn't fighting this battle alone. The days turned into a whirlwind of preparation. Emma gathered every scrap of evidence, every document, every memory, filling in every gap she could think of. She felt a quiet, fierce power building inside her as each piece fell into place. She was ready, more ready than she had ever been. For too long, David had controlled her life from the shadows, but now, she would ensure he faced the consequences of his choices. With each email, each call, and each carefully collected document, Emma felt herself reclaiming not only her life but the future she was determined to build, for herself and especially for Lily. As the ship docked at its next port, Emma felt her heart pound with anticipation. Mr. Callahan had worked quickly, piecing together a legal strategy from the evidence Emma provided, alongside the eager cooperation of the creditors. They had enough to formally charge David with fraud, abandonment, and falsifying his own death, serious offenses that carried real consequences. Emma waited in the shadows of the ship's lounge, watching as two officers made their way up the gangplank, Mr. Callahan trailing just behind them. She felt a strange calm wash over her as they passed, her chest filling with an odd mixture of relief and bittersweet satisfaction. She had dreaded this moment for so long, imagining the confrontation countless times. But now that it was happening, she realized she didn't feel anger or hatred, just a powerful sense of closure. She stayed out of sight, not wanting to face David directly, but she listened as the officers approached him. They found him lounging on the deck, chatting with a small group of wealthy friends. His carefree laughter faded quickly when he saw the uniforms, his face going pale as he processed the severity of the situation. Emma felt a pang, an old habit of caring for him flaring up, but she pushed it away. This was his doing, his betrayal, and she could finally let it go. The officers asked him to come with them, their voices low but firm. David began to stammer, denial flashing across his face as he looked frantically around, as if seeking someone to save him. Emma caught a glimpse of his eyes darting over the deck, searching the crowd, but he couldn't see her in the shadows. His words grew desperate as he tried to maintain his composure, attempting to brush off the officers' questions and protest his innocence. But they were unmoved, and within minutes, he was escorted off the ship, his carefully crafted life unraveling before everyone's eyes. Emma took a deep breath, feeling an incredible lightness settle over her. It was over. David's deception, his betrayal, his abandonment, all of it was finally coming to an end. She had spent so many years bearing the weight of his actions, his choices, but in that moment, she realized that burden was no longer hers to carry. The following day, Mr. Callahan contacted her with an update. David had been formally charged and would be facing trial. The creditors had joined forces, determined to reclaim what was owed, and Emma's testimony would be a key part of the proceedings. She felt a rush of gratitude for Callahan, his thoroughness and compassion giving her strength during the difficult process. Her heart felt lighter than it had in years, knowing that she had finally brought David to justice. As she prepared to leave the ship and return home to Lily, Emma felt a new sense of purpose filling her. She had faced her darkest fears, overcome unimaginable hardship, and come out stronger, braver, and more determined than ever. Her thoughts drifted to her daughter, and she imagined holding Lily close, finally free from the shadows of the past that had haunted them both. On her last day aboard, Emma stood on the deck, watching the sea stretch endlessly before her, vast and filled with promise. For the first time, she felt a deep peace settle within her, a calm that came from knowing she had reclaimed her life, her dignity, and her future. David was no longer a part of her story. His betrayal had been erased, leaving her free to write a new chapter, one filled with hope, resilience, and love. With a final glance at the horizon, Emma turned away, ready to leave the ship behind and return to the life she would build for herself and Lily, a life shaped by strength, courage, and the unbreakable bond between mother and daughter. Stepping off the ship for the last time, Emma felt the fresh morning air fill her lungs, a breath free of burden and fear. It was as if every step she took toward home peeled away the last remnants of the past, leaving only her unshakable resolve and love for her daughter. She hadn't told Lily much about her time away, just that she was working hard for their future. Mrs. Caldwell, her trusted neighbor, had watched over Lily with the care of a loving grandmother, sending Emma letters and updates whenever possible. Emma's heart swelled with gratitude for this quiet, supportive woman who had held down the home front in her absence. When Emma arrived back at the small apartment, it felt strange, both familiar and new. The worn walls and chipped furniture that once held so many memories of her struggles now seemed to shimmer with possibility. But the most beautiful sight awaited her inside. Lily, her precious daughter, whose face lit up with pure joy as soon as Emma stepped through the door. "Mommy!" Lily cried, running to her with open arms, her small frame wrapping tightly around Emma's waist. Emma knelt down, pulling Lily close and closing her eyes, savoring the warmth and sweetness of her child's embrace. Every sacrifice, every tear, every sleepless night faded in the face of this one precious moment. She was home, truly and finally home, with nothing left standing between her and the future she would build for them. "How was it, Mommy?" Lily asked, her big, curious eyes shining with excitement. "Did you see the ocean every day? Was it like you told me in the stories?" Emma smiled, brushing a strand of hair behind Lily's ear. "Yes, sweetheart, I saw the ocean every day and it was beautiful. But nothing is as beautiful as coming home to you." She knew she would eventually share the story of David with her daughter, in a way that Lily could understand, and when the time was right. But for now, she simply held her daughter close, whispering promises of love and comfort, filling the space around them with words of reassurance. They were safe now, together, and she would make sure their days of worry and fear were over. They spent the rest of the day in simple joy, baking cookies together, reading stories, and laughing over the silliest things. Emma was surprised by how easily she slipped back into these small routines with Lily, each moment reminding her of the life they had before and the life they would now create anew. As they baked, Lily covered Emma's nose in flour, giggling uncontrollably, and Emma found herself laughing, truly and freely, for the first time in years. Later that evening, as Emma tucked Lily into bed, she marveled at the strength they had both shown to get here. She had protected Lily from the worst of it, but even in her innocence, Lily had carried her own kind of resilience. Emma was overwhelmed with gratitude for this second chance, this clean slate upon which she could rebuild a life of love, laughter, and stability. As she watched her daughter drift off to sleep, Emma felt a profound sense of peace settle within her. She had faced her past, fought her hardest battles, and emerged victorious, if scarred. Now, she and Lily could begin a life free from the shadows of betrayal, a life defined not by hardship but by hope and the love that had carried them through it all. After Lily was fast asleep, Emma sat by the window, looking out over the quiet street illuminated by the soft glow of streetlights. The world felt still, as if granting her this moment to reflect on everything that had brought her here. For the first time, she allowed herself to look back, not with bitterness or regret, but with a sense of clarity that only time and distance could bring. She thought about David, about the love they'd shared, and the promises they had once made to each other. It was painful to confront that love again, to realize that the man she had devoted herself to was gone long before he faked his own death. But now, with the truth out in the open and David facing justice, she could look back without feeling that same sharp pain. She had mourned his death once, and now, in a way, she had finally buried him for good. Emma acknowledged her own strength, a strength that had emerged from every hardship, Every tear, every sleepless night she had endured for Lily's sake. She marveled at how much she had overcome, taking on countless jobs, bearing the weight of unending debt, and shouldering the grief of betrayal alone. She had transformed her pain into resilience, finding courage she hadn't known she possessed. The anger and resentment that had once consumed her were now only shadows, remnants of a time she had left behind. With each breath, she let go of the pieces of her past that no longer served her. Emma realized that her strength was no longer defined by survival alone, but by the capacity to forgive, to let go, and to move forward with grace and compassion, not just for herself but for her daughter, who deserved a mother free from bitterness. As dawn approached, Emma felt lighter, as though a great weight had been lifted from her chest. She was no longer the woman left behind, defined by David's choices and deceptions. She was Emma, a mother, a survivor, and a woman who had fought through the darkness to reclaim her own life. In the days that followed, Emma took small, intentional steps toward healing. She sought therapy, wanting to unpack years of hurt, and began journaling her journey, capturing her thoughts and reflections as a way to understand herself more deeply. Each entry helped her piece together the narrative of her own strength, giving her insights that furthered her healing. She also began reconnecting with friends, people she had distanced herself from during the years of her struggle. These were the people who had offered support when David was gone, who had shared kind words, brought meals, or simply sat with her in her silence. She realized now how much she needed these friendships, how they were a part of her growth and healing. Slowly, she found joy in their company again, her laughter more genuine, her conversations deeper, her heart open to connection. Emma even started volunteering at a local shelter for single mothers, offering support to women facing similar challenges. Sharing her story was cathartic, and hearing theirs reminded her of the resilience they all carried, each one unique yet bound by a shared strength. In helping others, Emma felt her own heart mend. Each day, she felt her world growing a little brighter, her past fading gently into the background. The pain was still there, but it no longer ruled her. Instead, it became a quiet testament to her survival, a reminder of what she had overcome. Emma knew healing would be a journey, but for the first time in a long time, she felt truly at peace. She was ready to move forward, hand in hand with Lily, toward a future they would build together, one that was rich, not in wealth, but in love, gratitude, and the strength they had found within themselves. With the past finally laid to rest, Emma felt a new sense of clarity about the life she wanted to create. Her journey had taught her to value what truly mattered: love, resilience, and the simple joys that too often went unnoticed. For the first time, she allowed herself to dream again, to look forward with hope rather than anxiety. One evening, while Lily played on the floor with her favorite stuffed animals, Emma found herself jotting down ideas in her journal. She thought of the small business she had always wanted to start, a cleaning service of her own, one that could eventually provide a steady income and stability for their future. Cleaning had once felt like a burden, a job she had taken on out of necessity. But now it felt like an opportunity, a skill that could become the foundation of a new chapter. Emma began researching, reading books about small businesses, making calls to local support groups, and even reaching out to women she'd met through her volunteer work. Some of them were experienced in business, and they gladly offered advice, encouragement, and insight. With each new piece of information, Emma's confidence grew, and the idea of owning her own business started to feel not only possible but within reach. Lily was her biggest inspiration, her guiding star through all the uncertainty. Emma knew that each choice she made was for her daughter's future, a future she was determined to make secure, nurturing, and full of possibility. They talked about it sometimes, in ways that Lily could understand. Emma would say things like, "One day, Mommy will have her own little company, and you'll be able to help me pick out the colors and the logo." Lily's eyes would light up, and her innocent enthusiasm filled Emma with even more determination. Months went by, and Emma steadily worked toward her goal. She secured her first clients through word of mouth, offering reliable and friendly service that quickly gained her a loyal base. Soon she had a small team, other single mothers she had met through her volunteer work. Together they built a company with a foundation in trust, compassion, and empowerment. They understood one another's struggles and supported each other, creating an environment where work was more than a job. It was a shared purpose, a way to lift one another up. As her business grew, so did her joy. She was able to take Lily on little weekend trips, enjoying the small luxuries she had once thought out of reach. They'd go to the beach, have picnics in the park, and explore museums, savoring each moment of laughter and connection. These experiences became priceless memories, filling Emma with a profound sense of fulfillment. Emma watched Lily grow, her daughter blossoming into a confident, happy child. Every night as she tucked Lily into bed, Emma felt overwhelming gratitude for the journey that had brought them here. The pain and betrayal of the past no longer held power over her. Instead, her experiences became the roots of a deep resilience, a quiet strength she would carry with her always. Emma understood that life would still have its ups and downs, its hardships and surprises. But she knew she could face anything now, grounded in the love she shared with Lily and the community of friends and colleagues who supported her. She was no longer alone. She was part of a network of people who had seen her through her darkest days and celebrated her brightest ones. One evening, as Emma watched Lily play in the yard, she felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. She had reclaimed her story, her strength, and her future. And in that moment, she knew that she and Lily would walk forward into a life shaped by their own hands, defined by love, courage, and the beautiful, unbreakable bond between them. With a smile, Emma closed her journal, setting it aside to embrace the life they had created, one filled with hope, resilience, and a future that was finally truly theirs.